At a time of an ever-widening wealth gap, the need to broaden access to land is urgent. Land access lies at the heart of issues of equity, affordable housing, vibrant main streets, sustainable agriculture, ecological restoration, renewable energy, alleviating the effects of climate change, and social entrepreneurship. It's that important. Community land trusts provide a regional way to fairly redistribute working lands. My name's Susan Witt. I'm executive director of the Schumacher Center for New Economics. I have a shaky hand and a shaky voice. Please excuse it. It's not because I'm afraid of you, it's a familiar tremor. In 1980, I helped found the Community Land Trust in the Southern Berkshires. Then in 2015, its sister organization, the Berkshire Community Land Trust. A community land trust acquires land by gift or purchase, creates a land use plan to determine how that land should be best used, taking into account ecological considerations and the needs of the community. It then leases the land to individuals or organizations on a 98-year lease. The lessees own the buildings and other improvements, fences, wells, roads, perennial stock, but not the land. The land remains in a regional commons in perpetuity. The lessee can sell the improvements on moving, but at no more than replacement cost of those improvements adjusted for deterioration. So a fair return on their investment, but the land value remains held by the community. It's not again capitalized. The Community Land Trust in the Southern Berkshires has 3 parcels with a total of 24 leaseholds. Indian Line Farm in Egremont, thriving CSA. Forest Row, a neighborhood of 18 families, and Albaster on Jug End with 3 homes and 2 nonprofit buildings. None of these were built with state or federal monies. All of the cost of building these 3 parcels came from donations from people within the community and the cost from the sale of the buildings. That's it. No state, federal monies, local initiative. But what we have seen over the years is the growing need to increase access to land as land prices rise. There are not enough government funds, not enough foundation dollars to meet this need. It will take a broad movement of land gifting into community land trusts if we are to even in a small way address the growing need for diverse access to land. Berkshire Community Land Trust is a tax-exempt organization that can accept gifts of land suitable for housing, farming, manufacturing, retail. It would then turn that land over to its sister holding corporation, the Community Land Trust in the Southern Berkshires, to lease and manage the leases. We would like to see gifts of working lands to community land trusts be as common as gifts of ecologically sensitive lands to conservation land trusts. That's our goal, to increase the amount of land held in the commons. If you have such a gift of land to discuss, please seek out one of our board members. John Fulop is our president. John, would you raise your hand? Today's program is sponsored by Berkshire's, Berkshire Agricultural Ventures, Berkshire Food Co-op, Berkshire Grown, Berkshire Waldorf High School, Egremont Land Trust, Good Work Institute, Great Barrington Agricultural Commission, Green Agers, thank you. John Fulop Associates, Architects and Planners, the Nonprofit Center of the Berkshires, the Nutrition Center, Southern Berkshire Community Development Corporation, and the Watershed Center in Millerton. These are some of our favorite nonprofits. Please join them, and it's going to take all of these groups working together to bring attention to the issue of land access. It's now my pleasure to introduce my Schumacher Center colleague, David Bollier, who will introduce our speakers this late afternoon on the topic of the impact of private philanthropy on local economies. David Bollier is one of the best known authors on and advocates for the commons. His 2014 book, Think Like a Commoner, is kind of the go-to text on the commons. He is co-author of the forthcoming book, Free, Fair, and Alive, The Insurgent Power of the Common. David was the 2017 speaker for this very annual meeting. It's a pleasure to welcome him back. Join me, please.
I'm David Bollier with the Schumacher Center for New Economics. I direct the Reinventing the Commons program, and I'm thrilled to be here with you all. We have two really remarkable philanthropists to join us. Peter Buffett with the NoVo Foundation, and Peter Taylor with the Taconic Community Foundation. And I'm going to give a brief introduction for both of them, and then we will begin to explore the topic of philanthropy and local community transformation and the different ways in which this can occur. Let me start with introducing Peter Buffett. He's the co-president of the NoVo Foundation with Jennifer Buffett, and he found an unusual path to get to philanthropy, starting as a commercial composer for film and other media, picking up an Emmy along the way and writing a book, Life is What You Make It, which made it to the New York Times bestseller list. He now pioneers a kind of venturesome philanthropy, both in New York and Kingston, New York, where he resides. And he also, drawing upon his previous background in music, does a series of concert and conversation performances around the country, most recently under the auspices of the United Way. NoVo is now funding a lot of fresh bottom-up initiatives that show great promise, and he has a penchant for trying to convene diverse shareholders, or stakeholders, I should say, around a common problem or goal. They're very active in Kingston, which I suspect will be a lot of the focus of his conversation today, especially through his Supporting Thriving Local Communities program at the NoVo Foundation. Peter Taylor is the president of the Berkshire Taconic Community Foundation, which was established in 1987. It comprises, its area of giving includes Berkshire County, Litchfield County in Connecticut, and in New York, Dutchess County and Columbia County. Very different type of philanthropy and foundation than NoVo, which we will get into. But Peter deals with a lot of special challenges of philanthropy in rural regions with focus on economic opportunity, educational attainment, and community engagement, among other topics that we'll get into. He formerly had a role at the Maine Community Foundation, where he dealt with many similar issues, including post-secondary education, fostering leadership, and helping Maine's environment and downtowns flourish. He's been deeply involved with philanthropy for many years, including with leadership roles at the Council on Foundations, Grant Makers for Effective Organizations, Maine Philanthropy Center, among others. So why don't we start off by I'm going to ask each to give a brief overview of their work, their foundation, their special character of their foundation, and the types of grant making they do, especially within local communities. And Peter, why don't we start with you and the NoVo Foundation?
Turn on my microphone. Okay. Hello. Thank you. Thanks for coming. Thank you, David. So I'm glad you brought up the earlier part of my somewhat adult life. For many decades, I wrote music for commercials and television and film, and what that gave me is a comfortable sense of the unknown, creativity. Someone would walk in and say, we need something by this afternoon, and I started to get comfortable with that. And of course, didn't recognize that years later that would inform how NoVo works more thoroughly than I would have ever even expected, and mostly because I didn't expect NoVo. My wife Jennifer and I had a small foundation that my parents gifted us in the late 90s, early 2000s. But in 2006, what I call the Big Bang happened. My dad decided to give all his money away, and that was wonderful, but we did not realize we would be the recipients of some of that. Jennifer and I ended up in 2006 with $1 billion foundation, and $1 billion foundation, you're better looking, you're funnier, you get invited places, you know, it's this magical thing that happens. But quite seriously, we did not inherit any legacy, any expectation. It was a blank slate, and that was an extraordinary gift, again, that I didn't fully realize at the time. But given the creative nature of both Jennifer and myself, the fact that we suddenly had resources that could be distributed in ways where, you know, my dad wasn't directive at all. There's feedback slowly coming in somewhere. You know, that gave us just exciting possibilities on what we could do. And so I will say that the short version of what we do, you can go to the website to learn a lot more, but it's around starting with girls and women and supporting girls and women in a variety of ways, supporting social emotional learning, how kids are raised and brought into the world through the current school system and hopefully beyond. Work in local communities, which is of course what we'll talk about today, and indigenous communities as well. And so we're doing a lot of work in very specific areas that I feel are all related. And that is the short history of the NoVo Foundation.
Peter, tell us about the Berkshire Taconic Community Foundation.
Yes, first of all, thank you to the Community Land Trust and Schumacher Center for pulling us all together here today. Berkshire Taconic is a community foundation, which is a place-based funder, and so we predominantly care about people and places and how those elements come together to build strong and vibrant communities. We've been around, as David said, for 30 years, and we serve a funky region across 4 counties in 3 states. Unlike a private foundation, which Peter described, a community foundation is really built around relationships, and we, over our 30 years, have established about 540 funds through the philanthropy of individuals and families and organizations and community groups who care about this place, care about the people in the place, and want to use philanthropy as a tool to bring about positive social change. And so over the course of those 540 funds in a given year, we make around $7 million in grants, and we also manage endowments for nonprofits, and we distribute about $2 million a year to support nonprofit missions through that stewardship of their endowments. So it's a little bit different from a from a private foundation, where Peter and Jennifer and a board really come up with a strategy for how they want to pursue their philanthropy against the goals they establish. We support the goals of many individuals and families, but really the art of community foundation work, in my view, is how a community foundation, in its deep knowledge of place, its deep knowledge of the issues that are really critical to this place, how we can pull together those resources, those relationships, and focus them on some of the most pressing issues facing our region. And as David said, at Berkshire Taconic, we have identified 3 issues where we are in the process of building donor relationships and nonprofit relationships to try to have philanthropy contribute to solutions on those issues. So there's a little bit different in terms of the locus of control, in terms of decision making, but a network that is under a community foundation that is really quite powerful.
Thank you. Thank you for those introductions. Let's start talking about how you intervene, how you decide what might be an effective way to have a positive impact on the community, either in the midterm or the longer term. And I'd be curious about some of the strategic priorities that you both encounter in trying to move forward. Peter, Taylor?
Well, I'll start.
Call on Peter, and you might get either one of us.
One of us.
I will use your last name since
Right.
For the foundation, how do we start? We start again. I mean, we support individual donors and community groups that are addressing their issues, and we support them by giving them information and introducing them to organizations that are working in the areas. We bring groups together, we convene. We also, though, in the last 3 years, have been really placing an emphasis on data and different types of data to really better understand this place and the people in it. We undertook a fairly in-depth community assessment process that put a premium on outreach, and so we did not just rely on the quantitative data, even though that's important. We really wanted to go out and listen and learn from the residents, from individuals who were living in communities that were experiencing challenges as well as opportunities. One of the things that's important about the foundation is that we very much take an assets-based approach, but we're clear-eyed on the challenges. And so you asked, how do we intervene? We intervene by listening and by learning and through connections.
And substantively, what have you learned from that data? What are the opportunities people want, or what do you think are some of the needs that need to be addressed?
Yeah, there are 3 things that surfaced, I think, that are most germane to this conversation, David. One is, through that assessment process, we learned that there were concerns around the levels of community engagement in our region. This is a region that has a deep tradition of connectedness and people coming together to organize around issues. A proxy for that is just the depth of nonprofit organizations that exist. And so we heard from our outreach that there were concerns that perhaps the level of engagement is not as high today as it was 10 or 20 years ago. That's really hard to quantify, but as the region's community foundation, we wanted to do that. And at the same time, when there are demographic changes, where there's a large influx of immigrants, which are so important to the vitality of this region in the long term, to our communities and to our workforce, how can we really invest and work around building cohesion and trust in the region? So community engagement is one. The other 2 will not be a surprise. Income inequality. Poverty is not going in the right direction in this region, especially especially, I'll mention here in Berkshire County in the last, 20 years, it's gone up 25%, which is, it's still below the national average, but again, it's going in the wrong direction. So income inequality is an area that we are focused really, again, through an assets-based perspective in terms of how can we create economic opportunity for residents here. And then the last one is really about jobs in the economy, which is very closely connected to income inequality. But as we did our work in the region, listening and learning, jobs was the predominant issue that came up. There's been a shift in shift in the economy, but now a mismatch between the skills that many employers need and what residents can offer. So jobs in the economy is the third.
So we'll get to Peter Buffett in a moment, but I'm curious, how are you trying to create more jobs or deal with inequality in programmatic ways?
Well, there are, in both those areas, we are working in partnership, really trying to think in new and creative ways about the role of philanthropy in supporting economic opportunity and economic development. And so we know we have something to contribute, but we know it will be much more powerful if we work with others in the private sector, others in government, and other funders. And so we have been working, and I'll spotlight the work in Berkshire County since we're here, really across that coalition to really investigate, what are the conditions around economic development, especially business support, and supporting individuals and existing businesses that want to contribute to the economy through enterprise development. So we have undertaken a lot of discussion and listening and also analysis on how we can think about philanthropic capital broadly defined, yes, to include grants, but thinking about loans and investments, but also what's that, what are the core conditions around economic development? How does someone who has an idea, who wants to start a business, especially if they do not come from a family or a background where they have watched their parents do that or their grandparents do that. How do we support those residents who want to start an enterprise that can allow them to more meaningfully contribute to the economy? So I can share more about how we're doing that tactically, but I want to make sure.
Let's get into that in a minute, because there are a number of specific areas we can talk about. Peter Buffett, tell me about about the Kingston experience and some of your the history and points of engagement in developing things there.
Yeah, and thank you. It's because of the history of the foundation and the fact that it doesn't have one. It does give us this sort of blank slate, which is exciting. And we did for a number of years work through the lens of girls and women and gender and justice, and and we still do. But as my wife Jennifer and I moved up north of the city, there was a lot of time for, frankly, just connecting to nature and reflection, and a lot of learning and reading, and listening is if real estate is location, 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 philanthropy is listen, 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 for sure. And this awareness now that lived experience is such a critical piece of it. That wasn't always the case. People had sort of this colonial mindset of coming in to solve the problem that other people were having. So it's nice to see those things changing across the board. But my work in Kingston, our work in Kingston, it was informed more than anything else from one event. And that was after Hurricane Irene in 2011. First of all, I'll say that I have a few phrases for the foundation that aren't publicly announced anywhere, and one of them is that NoVo Foundation is putting money out of its misery, and we can talk more about that later. But the other one is that we're trying to practice 21st century alchemy. We're trying to turn money into love. And what does that look like, and how do you create that experience and those conditions in place specifically? So after Hurricane Irene, I was driving around with my wife Jennifer looking at, it was extraordinary. I'd never seen anything like it. We were out of power for a week, and it was a big one. And what I was so struck by was that these tall, mature, seemingly intractable trees that were solidly in the ground a few days before because what a hurricane does is, it covers the whole watershed. There's no place for water to go. The ground is totally soaked to the point where these trees, that again are healthy, solid, big trees, they lift up out of the ground and just fall over. The root ball, I'm sure you've all seen it, the root ball and all, it's just fallen over. And I looked at that because I do believe nature holds most of the information we need to learn from. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. If the ground gets soaked, these seemingly intractable things they just fall right over. And so, as simple as that may sound, I thought, well, here we have a couple of interesting ingredients. The foundation bought a 1,500-acre farm, a very wonderful, fertile farm, right near a 23,000 population community, Kingston. And those were interesting combinations of, it's one thing to have resources, it's another thing to have land that can support the people that it's close to, and vice versa. And we had aligned city government, we had aligned, still do, county government, and a lot of young activists in the area. And so I started to see these ingredients as the ground, literally and figuratively, and thought, if we can soak this, not indiscriminately, but if we can go in there and be in relationship, which is critical, and learn and listen and start to see where we can soak the ground and see what can fall over. See what things that seem like they're just the way things are and they always will be. Of course they aren't. We're making it all up. The favorite reference to that is, what day is it? And we all say it's Sunday because we agree it's Sunday, right? We have all these agreements about what's happening right now. And most of them were put in place a relatively short time ago. It's been 150 years for most things, including wage labor. I mean, it was considered un-American to be a wage laborer, or certainly the last thing on the list until the Industrial Revolution. So my kind of fascination with how we got here, and then seeing that we had the ingredients to maybe help get out, and how interesting that money might be the solution to getting out of the thing that money created to some extent. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question yet.
That's a fascinating overview, but I'd like for you to give some more specifics of some of the instruments.
Right.
You mentioned the farm, which is critical.
Right. Yeah.
And in fact, I'd like both of you to address the important, this is, after all, the Community Land Trust meeting.
Right.
And I'd like to know the importance of land as a keystone issue on lots of issues that we confront.
And so the first two the interventions, to some extent, or creations of conditions, the farm absolutely first, and that is an ongoing process of orienting a farm from what was a monocrop sweet corn 3-generation business operation into something that is related to the community in ways that we haven't completely figured out, but we know we're orienting that way. And that's a lot of this, is how we're orienting things. And you can see it in the culture of the farm. Everybody is on the same page, but we're writing the book as we're doing it. The second big intervention, again, I don't like to call it an intervention, but whatever you named it was right. Was a radio station. There was a legacy radio station in Kingston, I think 79 years old, 80 this year, I think, AM station. It was the voice of the community. Of course, it ended up getting sold and sold again and sold again to a corporate owner that had 400 other stations, to where it was essentially ignored. One guy kept the lights on, and he's still there. He's wonderful. And the foundation was able to purchase that for a surprisingly small amount of money, given the asset that it promised to be. And it's been going now for about a year and a half, not quite, and it is transformational in terms of the community hearing itself, understanding itself, really having a dialogue, because it went from a corporate-owned AM oldies from, broadcast from somewhere else except for a few hours a day, to a community-run station that it's first and foremost, it was about reflecting the voice. We have 30-some programs now that reflect just about everybody there. I just came from their spring party, and it's extraordinary to see what happens when a community is given the ability to talk to each other and about itself and understand each other. So that has been a surprisingly robust and fast transformational element that I really didn't see coming. I knew there was something important about the community in relation, but yeah, the farm and the radio station, I could name a whole bunch of other ones, but those are big infrastructure pieces.
Well, it seems that really a recurrent theme, maybe for both of you, is the importance of infrastructure, of which land is an important part. And maybe Peter Taylor, you could talk a little bit about some of the roles of land or other infrastructure in helping to improve communities.
Certainly. You know, what I like about Peter's example of the radio station is that it had been and it had the potential to continue to be a key strength and hub for civic life in Kingston. And so you saw, you know, its past, but you also saw that it had a future to play that role, and you had the nimbleness to secure it and to make sure it remained community owned. And that is so important in terms of civic infrastructure. You know, you mentioned land, and land broadly defined. I mean, land obviously is very important here in Berkshire County because of you know, the rich natural resources here and the heritage of outdoor activities and the scenic view sheds. It's just a spectacular place. Land is important. You know, I just mentioned farmland being particularly important to this whole region as NoVo has made a big investment on a farm. Farmland, broadly defined, is important. In Berkshire County, actually, farmland is in decline. Over a 15-year period, we lost around 11% of our working farmland, which is problematic, obviously, as you think about local economies and its reliance on local agriculture, the jobs and the economic activity that produce and value-added products provide. But also, once you lose farmland and you develop it for other purposes, it's lost forever, or typically if you put a subdivision on it or change its use. And so I think protecting farmland has and will continue to be important in places like Berkshire County, where there's a rich heritage of agriculture, but also a sector that has so much promise for continued growth. I think another aspect of land that's important in terms of infrastructure is housing, affordable housing. And that is an issue here in Berkshire County in a couple of ways. One is obviously the cost of housing is high. That's for a variety of reasons. The number of homes that are owned for second home purposes, vacation homes, that's such an important part of our economy, are those residents that come here for part of the year. You know, they often are members of boards of directors, they contribute locally, but those houses are not occupied 12 months out of the year, and typically they're not sending kids to schools. So I think year-round affordable housing is important in the context of land, and even broader in terms of infrastructure. I think it is downtown centers that work, and places like the St. James Place that allow activities like this, where people can come together and be together in community. And I think, you know, around town centers and facilities like this, I think a key asset in Berkshire County, which is a form of infrastructure, is the rich arts and culture that exists in Berkshire County. And I think that is a core asset for community building and also key to the economic fabric of the county.
Are either of you involved in your philanthropy with Community Land Trust or some of the innovations that are going on there? I know the Schumacher Center, for example, has been exploring community-supported industry and the gifting of land to try to accelerate the use of CLTs. I'm just curious what may be going on in your wheelhouse in both of those areas.
I know you. You want to go first?
No, you go ahead.
Well, there is a community land trust in Kingston, and it was started by the mayor, actually, and a couple other people, so that helps, again, this alignment. And they were mostly oriented, in fact, entirely, I think, on green space and various ways they could reclaim or develop more green space in the county and the city. And That was wonderful, but when I started to get more involved, what I had learned from the mayor is that in Kingston, I'm sure it's different everywhere, but after 3 years of back taxes, the city forecloses on the home and takes it back and auctions it off. And the mayor was very thoughtful in keeping all the single-family homes out of the auction. He didn't want them going to speculators because gentrification is a huge issue in Kingston. And so he kept those back in hopes that there would be a mechanism to somehow get them back into the community, knowing that the land trust existed, but actually wasn't thinking of that, I don't think, as the mechanism, because he had started that for green space. But I came in and started to look at the work of John Davis and others that have kind of spearheaded a lot of the land trust and land bank relationships. And I had learned that Kingston was on the verge of land bank status but hadn't gotten it from the state. We pushed that over the line and got it, so now we are in the process of all those 30 houses, of which there's now something like 36 or 38, being moved into the land bank that is a city organization, and they will rehab those houses and then turn them over to the land trust, who has shifted their mission, which is something I didn't want anybody to do any shifting of mission if it wasn't embedded in where they were hoping to go. But they saw this as a real opportunity and realized that this is so necessary, again, with gentrification and affordable housing being in terrible shape in Kingston. It really does seem like it's the issue everywhere. Right? It's amazing how consistent that is. But so we are literally in this very beginning stage of the land bank land trust relationship, specifically for housing and to shift housing back into community, and how that's structured is we can go into that, but I think it's pretty common.
Peter Taylor?
Well, I have to say, since we're at the annual meeting of the Berkshire Community Land Trust, I have to say I admire both, the outcome that they're working towards and the process in which they go about it in terms of securing and preserving affordable housing, but doing it through community, and building a community around that is so important. And I think if you look, beyond that in terms of how the Land Trust and the Schumacher Center are trying to think about cooperative industries and thinking about the economy in inclusive ways to spot opportunities for businesses either that exist or that can be created to stop the leakage out of revenue that is going from companies either outside that are importing in. Can we create that here and have that economic transaction activity stay right here local? So it's about community, it's about place, but it's also about economic activity, and I admire all those factors together.
Both of you have sort of led up to an issue that I think we should explore a little bit more, which is how do you bring a diverse community together to help deal with some of these issues? You obviously, as a philanthropy, can deal with a lot of issues yourself, but of course, much the point is building the trust, the relationships, the shared purpose. So I'd love to hear from both of you about some of the ways that you've been trying to do that, because that's not just here, but I think across the country, a common challenge that we all face.
Well, I don't know who said it first, but the moving at the speed of trust line is a great one, and it's as fast as anyone can move if you really want to make things happen. And I go back to the radio station. I mean, obviously convenings and listenings and getting people in the room that wouldn't be in the room is critical, and the station, again, to some extent to my surprise, has played that role much more broadly than I would have expected, because it's also going to City Hall and live streaming what's going on there. It's creating block parties. It's creating convenings around particular issues. So the radio station is sort of cover in a way, or a front for all these mechanisms to get people to be more aware of what's going on in their community, and then finding ways to engage around it. So that's been our single, biggest champion really, and vehicle for getting engagement, and the community is hungry for it. I mean, we've been very fortunate. I think that's a function of our time because of the dysfunction of disconnection that's been happening. People want it, and the station can really help provide it.
Peter Taylor.
Sure. Let me, first of all, since we're in Great Barrington, anybody out there involved in the local radio station that's just come back into active service here in Great Barrington? It's a wonderful story about how there had been a radio station that had been programmed by individuals here in the community, and then it went through a period of just doing recorded music, and they've just set up a storefront again right here in downtown Great Barrington. So it's wonderful to see the community come together to make that happen again. How are we bringing people together, or more importantly, how are we supporting others to do that too? I guess I give you two examples, David. One is, I think you shared, and perhaps I have as well, an area of focus for the foundation is community engagement, trying to foster more civic engagement and relationships and trust. And one of the ways that we're doing that in Berkshire County is through supporting arts and culture as a vehicle for community building, but also as a way to empower others to see the creative process as a way to express themselves and also to come together in groups to learn about one another. We're in the midst of a multi-year initiative which is supporting that in a number of ways. We're doing that in partnership with the Barr Foundation, which is one of New England's larger private foundations, and they are working with Berkshire Taconic to support our efforts in Berkshire County. And so we're doing that through a number of ways. First, just in terms of listening to residents, as we started to approach our aim of increasing community engagement through the arts and culture, arts and the creative process, we knew we had researched it enough to come up with an hypothesis, but we also knew we needed to know a lot more. And so as the theme of this panel, we knew we had to listen to the community. And so we went out first and we did a neat project called community-based participatory research, where we hired local residents in Pittsfield to work with a community researcher from Boston University to identify their questions in terms of the barriers in front of their neighbors for either accessing venues right now that offer arts and culture, or barriers to the creative process. And so that is one way that we're doing it in economic.
In arts and culture, tell me some of the projects the specific, is this theater, is this murals, or?
All of the above. We are, one of the things that we have done, we've used the findings of that community-based research, and we learned a couple things. One, yes, cost and transportation are a huge barrier for participation in arts and culture, but as important to that is a sense of social inclusion, that when residents, especially those that are lower income or coming from communities of color, more under-resourced communities, how much they see themselves in what's on the stage, how comfortable they are when they enter through the doors of a venue. Do they see themselves in the volunteers? Do they see themselves on the boards of directors of those organizations? And so that sense of social comfort is really important. So we're doing a couple things. One, we are being a grant maker, and we are putting resources out in the community to try new approaches to community engagement through the arts, but we're also supporting organizations that have this as a priority to help them strengthen their effectiveness in the work. So it's capacity building is another piece. And then we are also supporting coalition building. We're helping arts organizations come together to leverage resources in their experience, especially in the area of arts education, because of the opportunity to partner with schools to have students in K through 12 settings really be enriched by the arts and the creative process, both in terms of how they get to know one another, but also as part of their learning and development.
Now, I'm curious how things have changed over the past 20, 30 years in terms of philanthropy. There's probably, we can talk about climate change and we can talk about the global economy. How does this get reflected in how you do regional or local philanthropy? Peter, Buffett, or, well, both of you actually.
Well, I certainly wasn't doing it. If you're talking about changes in philanthropy itself,
that's what I mean.
This is new.
Yes.
It's new territory for me. But what I'm sort of fascinated by is how over these past however many years it's been now, that people have seen our behavior and been inspired by it or surprised by it or something. Because again, we didn't have anything to work with, but in terms of having to live up to something or into something. But I mean, exactly what Peter was saying around the approach, I think, is finally getting to the place of who's in the room. Do they look like the people we're attempting to serve? The awareness of the systemic nature of things, the connections between intergenerational poverty and the education system and trauma-informed this, and these kinds of.
So how has that changed how you make grants or make priorities?
Well, I guess it really does get back to ultimately listening, but making sure a lot of people are in the room that may not have ever been invited into the room, that don't feel comfortable in the room. Mm-hmm. I think Russell Brand said there's a reason the halls of Congress look like the halls of Harvard. I mean, we forget how conditioned we are to be inside this frame. And so to break open the frame, you have to invite people in that have been historically left out. And so we do that in all of our work. We work in social emotional learning, and for a long time, these people are trying to figure out what do the kids need, And it's like, why don't we ask the kids? This kind of thing. But this is new kind of breakthrough approaches, which is, great. At least it's happening. But yeah.
Peter Taylor.
Yeah, I'll just build off that. What's changed in philanthropy, and I think that emphasis, that priority of listening to those that you're trying to support and to improve their well-being and their quality of life. Checking your assumptions continuously, but most importantly, I think the best ideas for change come from those that are living in communities that know them best. An example of how we have done that in an area related to land and economy is we have a multi-year initiative in Columbia County around increasing fresh and healthy food for low-income kids and seniors. We are working in partnership with a very generous anonymous donor couple, and we did a lot of outreach when we were trying to develop our goals and our strategies, but one of our core partners is Hawthorne Valley, which is just a neat organization in Columbia County that has a working farm and a school and does a whole lot more around community and economic development. And Hawthorne Valley is a core partner of ours, and when we we're working with Hawthorne Valley, but most importantly, providing them the resources to work in community in Columbia County. They knew they needed to go directly to the residents, and they started in Hudson, and they developed what's called a core group that met for about a year to really try to understand, the barriers to fresh and healthy food, and also how people in Hudson in particular, what their interest and their demand was for it. And even residents that were on public assistance, they had market power. They had resources to buy food, and they shared with the core group through surveys and outreach that they wanted fresh and healthy food that was connected to their cultural traditions. And so one of the things that Hawthorne Valley did in partnership with the community was support at first a pop-up fish market on Warren Street, because fish was very important to the cultural traditions to many people living in Hudson. And so they brought fish to residents. I'm not sure if you all have been to Hudson, but Hudson is just an eclectic community where you have Warren Street, which is, has such a vibe and cosmopolitan feel, and just 2 blocks away, is a much different reality for residents in Hudson. And so and it's actually quite far to get to the local grocery store in Hudson. It's about a 45-minute walk if you don't have a car. So they brought fresh fish to Warren Street once every 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and they built a sense that you could buy local and fresh food right downtown. And so then they moved from that, and they created a mobile market in partnership with the community, and now they have a retail store in addition to the mobile market. It all started because they listened to the residents. Not only listened, but they brought them together in a coalition to determine the solutions.
I'm struck by
throw in patience too.
Patience.
We're also patient, right? I mean, it took a year, it sounds like.
It did.
It
did.
Yeah.
And I'm struck by your story, and actually by that comment of the very paradoxical role of improvisation and patience. That these things unfold, you often don't know where it's going to go. And that must pose a special challenge to foundations in trying to deal with a dynamic situation in which there's many more players than before.
Yes, patience and flexibility and pivot is all that. And I'll just share in the example that I shared around the fresh and healthy food in Columbia County, we are indeed working with a very patient donor couple that sees us very much as an expression of love and social justice. And so they are patient and they have been flexible in terms of seeing the progress that was being made, in terms of building relationships and trust, and being flexible in terms of the time horizon to get the solutions that start to get some traction against the issue, but also flexible in terms of where the resources go. And to build coalitions, you need people to do that work. It does not happen on its own. You need people to convene and to make sure that interactions are framed and facilitated and that agendas move forward. And so you need to be able to fund people that have that experience and expertise to be able to support communities that want to move forward.
Patience and love, yeah, they go hand in hand, I guess.
Well, let me ask maybe what's an unfair question, but there's a history of economic development in communities, and then there's other philanthropy that could arguably serve social purposes that are not as directly market development. And then, of course, in the meantime, there's been the development of a whole field called impact investing, in which it's providing capital that seeks some sort of return. How do some of those currents play out in your foundations? And it's probably complicated. Maybe it's not either or, but I'd be curious to know how you approach those.
I think let me just maybe frame it this way, and Peter has a lot more current experience with impact investing. I have some from my work in Maine, but we do have somebody who has a lot of experience right here. I think for me, it's really starting with what your aim is. What are you trying to accomplish? And what are the right tools to get there? And I think what is important with philanthropy is that it is flexible and patient, and it aligns the right tool for the task to get to the outcome that you want. And so sometimes, yes, that is a grant. Sometimes it's building a coalition. It's the people process. Sometimes it is a loan or an investment. Because you need that type of capital to interface in a market economy, or to do something at a scale that's difficult for a grant to do on its own. And so it's really starting with what your goal is and what's the best strategy and what resources necessary to make that strategy work. And oftentimes it's not one thing, it's a combination of things working together. I think the radio station example is a really good one where you purchased essentially an enterprise. I assume it's either a nonprofit or it's now it's a nonprofit. It was a for-profit and a nonprofit now, and so you purchased an infrastructure to do that. Right. So I think it's really lining up the right tool for the task, and I can. Just briefly, actually I'll defer to Peter, and then maybe I'll come back with some examples from my experience. But
sure.
Peter.
Well, for us, it's, I think, always a social investment first. It's never looked at through an economic lens. And the word impact and impact investing is tricky because investing, of course, doesn't even imply, it requires, I think, a return, even if you say it's going to be zero return. With the word investing, return is somehow attached to it. And really, we're looking for a return of, a different sort of social engagement and interaction, and it's all the soft stuff, I guess, as opposed to a hard quantifiable, we want this back for doing this. And so it's, framing it that way, we support a loan fund run by Indigenous people in the South. We have supported some of those types of things that would be considered, market-driven on some level. It's specifically loan funds, but how they operate, the intention behind them is so not return-oriented, but social-oriented still. Even when it's money going out, it's small loans, and it's in community, and it's decided by the community, and it's all these various factors that go into that. So, we really try and stay away as best we can from any framing that was built out of a structure that just isn't working for too many people. And so we try and look under the covers of that and say, okay, how can we shift this? And most often it's putting money in places without an expectation of return, and even, and I think maybe we'll talk about this a little more, pinning sustainability on it from day one, because that can be shackles for somebody that needs just, again, to soak what's there. We do a lot of multi-year general operating, that kind of thing, because we're saying we trust you, we believe in what you're doing, we're not going to micromanage. That's a little bit off of what you're asking, but it's just it's all about building trust and relationships, so you can hear the bad news when there's bad news. Nobody's trying to live up to some benchmark that you've set that was unrealistic because you hadn't thought of this. It's all social.
Peter, did you want to follow up?
I guess, impact investing or mission-related investing, it's one of those kind of jargony terms is, we sit up here and we talk about it. Maybe there's a sense of what is it out there. I mean, impact investing really represents a spectrum of investing where the investor, be it an individual or a foundation or even a corporation, really is investing with at least two purposes in mind. What is going to be the community benefit as a result of that investment? And because of that community investment, how does that factor into your investment thesis? And those conditions actually vary in terms of how much of a trade-off an investor is willing to make to get to the community benefit he, she, or they would like to see. And for, in my view, in a community foundation perspective or a philanthropy perspective, when a foundation or a donor makes an investment, it should be a tool for philanthropy, that your primary driver for that is the community benefit. But you are putting money out in a way that hopefully can achieve the outcome that you want, either because you can make a larger investment, so to speak. You can only make X amount of dollars available as a grant, but you could make a larger investment because even if you don't make any return, there's the ability to perhaps recover the capital to put it to use later for another community benefit, so there you can recycle it. And so that often prompts foundations and individuals to make larger bets on things that are important where that type of capital is what's needed. And so I think it's one of those terms that represents such a broad spectrum because there are impact investors out there that are doing good work that are really looking for more market rate returns, but they're looking to get those market rate returns in ways that are beneficial to the community or the environment. And that is important to have that capital motivated by those values, but it's different than having that investment be used as a tool for philanthropy.
Yeah, and I'll just throw in that, again, philanthropy means the love of people, right? It has nothing to do with money, actually. And the challenge is that when you have most, maybe everybody, who has a lot of money has done it in the frame that we're in. I mean, I think that by virtue of the fact they have, that's the only way they could have made it, and for the most part. And so you've got people with keen business sense and minds that have done really well and made a lot of money. Very hard to then say, okay, I want to move that money over here and give it away outside of the framework that made it. And so therein lies the real friction, is that you're trying to hopefully encourage someone that thinks they're brilliant because they made all this money, and they might be, that maybe they're not the best person to make these judgments over here about what these investments should be. So that's just a challenge in the mindset.
And I want to thank Peter Buffett and Peter Taylor for sharing their wisdom with us. So thank you.
Thank you, David.